There was a time when the edge of the world wasn't just unknown, it was terrifying, sacred, and strangely beautiful. A place spoken of in murmurs and inked on maps as a trembling line where dragons might wait and the sea might simply vanish into the sky. And yet in that fragile space between myth and silence, one man believed that the world could be circled like a prayer whispered to the stars. And if you let yourself sink gently into the rhythm of that thought, you might feel your breath slow, your muscles release their hold, your body begin to drift softly back to a time where the unknown was not something to fear, but something to follow. In that long ago time, in the early hush of the 16th century, there was no roar of engines or glowing screens to guide your way, only the push of wind against heavy linen sails, the rustle of sea charts drawn by hand and smoothed over worn wooden tables, and the cold gleam of stars blinking quietly above the deep, endless ocean. And if you close your eyes now and let the world around you blur, you may hear what they once heard, the creak of ships waiting in the dark, the distant rhythm of waves touching the stone edge of a harbor, the still and steady heartbeat of a voyage not yet begun, quiet but already alive in the shadows. The harbor itself breathes slowly beneath the soft light of a waning moon, its wooden planks slick with morning mist. Barrels stacked with salt pork and dried fruits lining the docks in patient rows. Its sails still furled like wings not yet woken, high above decks wrapped in silence. And in that stillness, 5 ships rested side by side, almost as if they were sleeping. Their names barely whispered, yet destined to echo for centuries to come. And somewhere among the flickering glow of lanterns and the soundless steps of men moving cargo in the dark, there stood a figure cloaked not in grandeur, but in the heavy stillness of quiet certainty. He was not yet the man history would name, not yet the symbol etched into bronze or recited in lessons across oceans. He was simply Magellan, a man whose life had been shaped by wind and water and time, a man born to maps and to silence, 2 long watches beneath skies that did not speak, and to questions too big for the smallness of the world he had known. And in his eyes there burned not pride nor ambition, something far more enduring curiosity. That quiet and wordless pull that draws the soul toward mystery, toward distance, toward whatever waits beyond the edges of comfort and reason. He had studied the heavens not as a mathematician measuring motion, but as a dreamer learning language, listening to the shifting moods of the stars, tracing with his eyes the slow arc of light and shadow, memorizing the way tides whispered secrets beneath the surface, learning how light softens when land draws near. And more than anything, he had listened to the voices of sailors who had seen strange shores, to the wind that changed without warning, to his own deep instinct that there must be something more than what had already been drawn and named. And as the world whispered warnings, he gathered his maps in his silence and quietly prepared to leave everything behind. To sail west, to leave familiar ports and trusted routes. It's not a gesture of pride or power, but one of reverence. It was not a charge toward conquest, but a surrender to something vast and unknowable, a quiet letting go of certainty in search of something deeper. And Magellan knew this. He felt it in the hush of his breath as he stepped onto the creaking deck that would become his entire world. In the way the rope slid through his hand like something living, in the way the sea stood still beneath the night sky as if waiting for him to decide. His journey would not begin with fanfare or celebration, but with silence, like the still air before dawn. Silence, like the breath held in the chest of the earth before the tide turns. Silence like a prayer whispered not to be heard, but to be released. And it is in that silence we begin now, you and I, not rushing forward but gently drifting, letting the story unfold at the pace of the ocean, letting it wrap around us like a blanket woven from wind and time. This is not a tale of battle or conquest, not a chronicle of victories or kings, but a story of vast distances and quiet resolve, of long stretches of water and of waiting, of one man's decision not to be loud, but to be steady, not to chase glory, but to follow the pull of the unknown. And if you find yourself sinking into the rhythm of these words, if you feel your shoulders soften and your thoughts grow slower, if your breath deepens like the sea at night, you are exactly where you need to be. So rest, if you wish, or stay with me in this half-light, in the still space where the sea is calm and time has no shape. There is no right way to travel through a story like this, just as there was no map to guide Magellan. Only the stars, only instinct, only the patience of the tides. And if your eyes begin to close and your mind begins to wander, that is not sleep overtaking you, it is the ocean reaching out to carry you gently toward its endless horizon. If you are listening from somewhere far away or in the quiet hush of night, feel free to share where and when this story finds you, or hold it like a secret between you and the sea, because these stories were once passed down in whispers, around fires and in candlelight, and now they travel through wires and across time, crossing centuries to reach you in the quiet of your own world. So let us begin, not with storm or conquest, but with breath and calm, with the whisper of sails stirring after long stillness, with the flicker of oil lamps trembling against the wind, with the first soft groan of timber ready to move again after waiting too long. The wind is rising now, and Magellan, standing beneath the stars, watches the dark horizon and listens. Before the journey, there was simply life, quiet, ordinary, and unfolding like a slow breath at the edge of the sea. People rose with the sun and rested with the stars, their days shaped by the rhythm of bells ringing softly in distant towers, the call of vendors echoing through narrow streets, and the murmur of conversations carried on the morning breeze through courtyards where herbs hung drying from windowsills and cats stretched in pools of early light. And though the world felt smaller then, bound by the cycles of harvests and prayers and shared routines, held within its stillness an ancient kind of peace, a way of being that asked nothing more than to exist gently, to live slowly, to know the world not by conquest but by its textures, the worn stone of a doorstep, the warm crust of a morning loaf, the weight of a gaze held just a moment longer than needed, and in those small details a quiet magic endured, unnoticed but deeply felt. The coastal villages stirred in the earliest hours when the sea was still a sheet of silver stretched to the edge of thought, their wooden docks damp with mist, their lanterns flickering against the wind as fishermen moved in practiced silence, their bodies guided not by sight but by memory, by the muscle-deep knowledge of tides and weather and nets that had been mended in the same manner for generations. And these men, hardened by salt and solitude, prepared their boats without ceremony. The creak of hulls and the slap of water against wood becoming a kind of prayer repeated daily without needing to be spoken. And all around them, the world watched without hurry, gulls circling overhead in slow arcs, the sun rising, inch by inch behind distant rooftops, and the scent of brine and smoke curling through the air, like a reminder that the sea was not just water, but presence, something alive, watching and waiting. The harbor breathed with its own quiet rhythm, a rhythm shaped by footsteps on planks, by the low murmur of dockhands loading crates filled with figs and almonds, by the soft rustle of sails still furled high above on sleeping ships, and each of those ships, resting side by side in patient silence, held within them 1,000 possibilities, their names barely spoken aloud, their keels heavy with both hope and fear. And around them, the people of the town moved gently, as if not to wake the dreams lying dormant inside the hulls, as if the ships themselves were listening for the moment when the wind would change, when a voice would rise above the others and whisper that it was time to go, and in that moment everything that had been ordinary might become something more. Not louder or brighter, but deeper, something remembered long after words had faded. Inland, the markets began to wake, their awnings catching the soft golden light of early morning, their baskets filling slowly with olives and apples, bolts of rough cloth, candles and spices brought from journeys already completed. And within the low hum of voices bartering and laughing and calling greetings to old friends, there was a sense that time moved differently here, slower and rounder, like a pebble turned smooth by years of passing water. And the merchants' faces lined by sun and laughter, hands calloused but kind shared, not just goods but stories, fragments of other places sewn into casual conversation, little clues that the world might be larger than it seemed, and that somewhere beyond the farthest road there were colors no one had yet named, and winds that carried unfamiliar songs. Children darted through these scenes like streaks of living light, barefoot and breathless, their laughter ringing out between buildings warmed by centuries of weather and waiting, and their joy untamed, unmeasured, was perhaps the truest expression of the world before the voyage, a world where the unknown was still safe, still wrapped in the embrace of stories told beside hearths and in bedchambers, lit by the flicker of oil lamps. Stories about brave sailors and faraway islands and treasures hidden beneath blue-green waves. And though the children did not yet understand the weight of such tales, they carried them like seeds, tucked beneath their skin, growing quietly with each passing day, preparing them in ways they could not yet name for a life that might one day drift beyond the edge of the map. The sea in those days was both boundary and invitation. Its horizon, a gentle line that called to the heart more than the eye. And the people who lived beside it learned to read its moods, the way others read books through the tone of its waves, the direction of its wind, the color of its foam, and the silence between its gusts. And they knew that to go out upon it was not just to move from one place to another, but to enter into a dialogue with something far older, something that listened and responded in ways too subtle to explain, and in that relationship there was both humility and awe. Because no matter how skilled the sailor or sturdy the ship, the sea always held the final word, always reminded those who dared cross it that they were guests in its domain, and that reverence, not mastery, was the only true compass. And within homes built from stone and timber, within kitchens warmed by slow-burning stoves and corners draped in shadow, the people lived layered lives of ritual and memory, their fingers moving through familiar motions, kneading dough, folding cloth, sharpening blades with a grace born of repetition. And each gesture was a kind of inheritance passed down through the body more than the mind. A language spoken not with words but with movement, and these quiet acts of care and creation gave shape to the world in ways that often went unnoticed, like the way a blanket holds warmth or a silence holds meaning. And in those spaces, the world breathed not with urgency, but with patience. The maps of that time, though drawn with care and adorned with flourishes of ink and imagination, could not conceal the truth they whispered beneath their ornate borders, that much of the world remained shrouded in unknowing, that beyond each delicately inked coastline and each intricately rendered compass lay territories not of conquest, but of mystery. And those who studied these maps in candlelit rooms with furrowed brows and breath held ever so slightly knew they were looking not just at geography, but at longing itself, longing, rendered in parchment and pigment, in beasts drawn on the edges where facts gave way to fear, in curves and coastlines that blurred the line between reality and wonder, and the more one stared at those blank spaces, the more they seemed to move, as if inviting a hand to fill them not with ink, but with footsteps, with salt, with time. And in the evenings, when the day's work had quieted into the low murmur of meal sharing and firelight, people turned their gaze upward to the sky, not with haste or calculation, but with stillness, with reverence, as if the stars themselves were speaking in a language no longer taught, but somehow remembered in the bones. And in that dark canopy, constellations stitched stories across the heavens, stories older than nations and deeper than oceans, stories of hunters and lovers and travelers who had long since vanished, but whose shapes remained, offering comfort in their permanence and mystery in their silence. And as the embers faded and the wind whispered through half-shuttered windows, the sky remained above it all, a great dome of patience reminding every soul below that time was vast and tender and waiting. The world was made not just of stone and sea, but of rhythms, the steady rhythm of the tides pulling softly at the edges of thought, the rhythm of hammers echoing in distant forges, of hands weaving fiber into fabric, of spoons stirring soup in worn wooden bowls passed down through generations. And this rhythm was not loud or hurried, but deep and enduring, like a heartbeat felt through the soles of bare feet on earth that had known centuries. And in this rhythm lived memory, lived purpose, lived a kind of unspoken agreement between people and place, an understanding that life, though ordinary on the surface, was made sacred through attention, through repetition, through the quiet art of remaining present, even when nothing seemed to change. In the churches and chapels scattered across the hills and coasts, where candles burned low and incense curled into the rafters like invisible prayers, the faithful knelt not only in devotion but in search of reassurance that the unknown was held in divine hands, that journeys begun in uncertainty might end in grace, and the air inside these sanctuaries was thick with silence and echoes, with whispered hymns and footsteps softened by stone worn smooth, and there was a sense almost tangible that even here, in the holiest places, the sea was never far away, that it spoke in the wind that slipped through stained glass, that its presence seeped into the sacred as a reminder that the divine was not only above, but also beneath and around and waiting. Seasons passed, not in numbers but in sensations. The scent of flowering herbs on warm spring mornings, the way sunlight filtered through grapevines in summer haze, the sound of boots crunching over frosted earth in winter, and people learned to live in tune with these changes, to adjust their pace to the tilt of the sun and the angle of shadow. And this attunement was not just survival, it was wisdom, the kind that can't be written in books, but is carried in the tilt of a head, in the patience of hands, waiting for the right time to sow, to harvest, to travel, and in this quiet trust of time's unfolding, the world breathes slowly, like an old story being remembered one word at a time. In those twilight moments between day and night, when everything seemed to hush just a little, there often came a feeling subtle, hard to name, but impossible to ignore, a sense that something was shifting, not urgently, but inevitably, as if the very air had begun to hum with possibility, and though no announcements were made and no great signs appeared, people felt it in the stillness of the wind, in the way dogs paused mid-step and birds grew silent on their perches. And this sensation, this quiet stirring, passed through villages and harbors like the faintest tremor of a dream just before waking. And those who noticed it rarely spoke of it, as if afraid that naming it might cause it to vanish. And still, the sea waited, unmoving yet never still, its vastness stretching outward like a thought that had no end. And those who stood at its edge, fishermen, traders, mothers, children, felt its pull in ways they could not always explain, as though the ocean did not simply offer passage, but asked a question each time a gaze lingered too long on the horizon, a question without words that lived in the space between waves. And it was this silent question, perhaps more than any single event, that prepared the world for what was coming, for the moment when sails would be raised not in defense or in trade, but in wonder, when a man would step onto a ship not to escape, but to seek, and the world would, for the first time, begin to feel itself opening. The world before was not a world of silence, but of softness, a world of layered textures and voices carried in the wind, of footsteps worn into familiar paths and stories repeated beside firelight until they sank into the walls, a world that held its breath not in fear, but in anticipation, as if it somehow knew that soon, very soon, someone would leave the known behind, not with force, but with stillness in their heart, and the courage to follow that which could not yet be seen. There are moments in history that do not begin with noise, but with the softest shift in the wind, with a glance held a little too long, with a silence that lingers just a breath past comfort. And in the quiet world before the voyage, these moments were beginning to gather like clouds over calm water, not to storm, not to frighten, but to whisper, to unsettle gently. And though most went about their days without noticing, those who paid attention, the old man watching the sky as he salted fish, the woman whose dreams had begun to change with the tide, the child who paused before stepping into the sea, felt it somewhere beneath the surface of things, a sense that what had always been might soon begin to shift, not suddenly, but like the slow erosion of stone beneath centuries of wind. It began in small ways, like how a merchant returned from a distant port, with news not quite shaped into words, his voice quieter than before, his eyes scanning the horizon, even as he poured wine and unrolled cloth from faraway lands. Or how the monks in the hilltop cloister found themselves spending longer beneath the stars, their charts growing more detailed, their prayers tinged with questions they had not dared ask in years, and all around. The world seemed to pause just slightly, as if listening for something coming from far away, a sound just below hearing, a rhythm not yet recognized but already felt in the bones like the ache before rain. The harbor, too, began to change, not with fanfare or construction, but with a subtle urgency that no one named. Crates stacked a little faster, sails mended with unusual precision, maps handled with care that bordered on reverence, and there was a growing presence of strangers. Men with sun-darkened skin and voices marked by many shores, who asked quiet questions in taverns and lingered longer in the shadowed corners of shipyards. And though no announcements were made, no ships launched just yet. The air around the docks carried a different weight, as if it were holding something in suspension, a breath not yet released. In the evenings, the fires burned lower but longer, and conversations drifted from harvests and festivals to rumors of new trade routes spoken of in whispers over mulled wine, of ships preparing for voyages, not of commerce, but of mystery, and of a man quiet but certain, who walked the docks not as a captain already known, but as one who listened more than he spoke, who studied the stars without naming them, who touched the hulls of ships with the care of someone saying goodbye to something beloved. And those who watched him did not understand what they saw, but they remembered, and they spoke of him later not with awe, but with quiet certainty, as if he had always been there, waiting. The children noticed too, not with understanding, but with instinct, their games changing in tone, their play drifting toward ships and stars and faraway places. Their drawings on stone and sand, no longer of fish and flowers, but of waves and sails. And in their laughter, there was something wild, something reaching, as if even in their innocence they could feel that the world was gathering its edges, preparing to unfurl, and their mothers watched with unease and wonder, braiding their hair a little tighter, holding their hands a little longer, not knowing why, but knowing nonetheless. At night, the stars seemed brighter, not in truth perhaps, but in perception, as if they leaned closer, aware that they would soon be charted with new purpose, named in new ways, used not just for beauty or stories, but for movement, for risk, and for the hope that somewhere beyond them was something waiting to be found. And those who studied them did so now with more intention, marking their positions with hands that trembled slightly, as though sensing that the sky itself was about to become less myth and more map, and yet still infinitely unknowable. In the towns, letters arrived with unfamiliar seals, written in tongues not often spoken aloud, letters that made shipowners pause, made clerks frown and calculate, made certain men vanish into private rooms with locked doors and drawn curtains. And these quiet negotiations, these unspoken agreements between coin and curiosity, began to ripple outward through the streets and taverns like ink spreading across linen, and though the majority remained unaware, the pulse of the place had changed, its heartbeat quickening, not with fear, but with anticipation. And still, no proclamations were made. No bells were rung to announce what was coming, because there was nothing official to speak of. Only the growing sense that something once impossible might now be within reach. And this realization did not come like lightning, but like a tide, slow and inevitable. Its arrival marked not by trumpets, but by questions spoken in kitchens and corridors, by candlelight flickering over open maps, by long pauses in mid-sentence when someone suddenly looked out the window and saw the sea in a different way. Even the animals seemed to know cats, sleeping in strange places, dogs barking at unseen shapes, horses restless in their stalls, and the fishermen who rose before dawn began to dream differently, waking with images of lands they had never seen, of winds that smelled of cinnamon and ash, and though they said nothing, they pulled their nets with a new kind of strength, as if preparing their bodies for distances that had never been traveled. The language of the town began to shift in tiny, imperceptible ways, new words slipping into conversation like stray feathers on the wind, new names spoken with careful curiosity, and the old tales once told to entertain or lull to sleep began to sound less like fantasy and more like prophecy. And the storytellers themselves noticed this, pausing in their rhythm, eyes distant, wondering if perhaps they too had always been part of something larger, something just now beginning to unfold. And somewhere in this gathering quiet, in this breathless space between what was and what might be, stood the figure we will come to know. Not yet famous, not yet followed, just a man with a question lodged deep in his heart, a man whose silence held the shape of oceans. A man who watched and waited, not for permission, but for alignment, for the wind to shift, the stars to say yes, the sea to part just enough to let him pass. The wind itself began to change not in force, but in intention, as if it too had caught word of something on the verge of becoming. And its presence, once merely weather, became a participant, brushing cheeks more deliberately, carrying scents not easily named. curling through alleyways and open shutters like a messenger, without urgency but with purpose. And those who felt it turned their heads instinctively, not knowing why. Only that something in the air had shifted, that the world no longer settled entirely within the frame of the familiar. And perhaps it never had, and now, slowly, it was beginning to show its edges, its questions, its open invitation to anyone quiet enough to listen. In the minds of some, the dreams became heavier, not darker, but thicker, as though wrapped in mist or woven from strands of a story not yet told. And these dreams came not just to those who longed for the sea, but to the bakers and the scribes, to the girls who sang while shelling beans and the boys who carved names into wood with idle hands. And in their sleep, they glimpsed pieces of what might come vast water with no shore. Stars that danced in new constellations, ships gliding into sunlight not yet born, and they woke with hearts pounding softly, unable to remember fully, unable to forget completely, and though they carried on as before. The dreams lingered at the edge of every motion, quiet as breath, but unshakable. And so the world, while still appearing the same in the soft morning light, the same bells ringing from the same towers, the same pots steaming on the same stoves, the same children chasing the same dogs through the same crooked streets, was no longer entirely the world it had been, because now something moved beneath the surface, a pull, gentle but constant, a current that did not rush but beckoned, and within that current a question had been planted, not in any one person, not in any one place, but in the very rhythm of existence itself, a question without words, shaped like a journey, waiting not to be answered but to be lived. He was not born with a map in his hand or a destiny marked in stars, but with a quiet gaze and a mind that wandered farther than his feet were allowed to go. And even in childhood, when other boys raced through the fields chasing clouds of dust or tossed stones at the distant cliffs to hear the echo, he often stood apart not out of pride or fear, but because he was listening, always listening to the wind through the olive trees, to the low hum of insects beneath the grass, to the spaces between sounds where something seemed to wait. And those who watched him then may have mistaken his stillness for shyness, but in truth, it was attention, deep and unbroken, the kind of attention that makes the world reveal itself in layers others never think to look for. His family was neither noble nor nameless, anchored in modest comfort. With blood tied to the earth and hands accustomed to both the sword and the prayer, and though his lineage offered no throne to ascend, it offered stories passed down in firelight, stories that curled into his sleep like smoke, stories of lands that blinked on the edge of maps, and of men who disappeared into the sea with only stars for company. And these stories did not promise riches or glory, but mystery. And it was mystery that took root in him like a seed pressed deep beneath memory, waiting to grow. He learned early to read, but he read not as a scholar reaching for knowledge, but as a boy pressing his ear to a closed door, searching not for facts but for echoes, for the space between the lines where wonder lived. And he lingered not on dates or titles, but on the way words curved around distance, on the way the names of far-off places felt in the mouth, foreign and electric, like spells spoken softly, and as his fingers traced the contours of coastlines on faded pages, his thoughts drifted beyond them, imagining not what had been found, but what might still lie just beyond the ink. His education followed the path carved out for boys of his standing courtly skills, discipline, arithmetic, and arms butt, while his peers measured success in duels won and etiquette performed. He began to measure it in silence, in how long he could stare at the horizon without blinking, in how many stars he could name by breath alone, in how precisely he could remember the smell of a southern wind before a change in weather. And it was this attentiveness, this unshakable relationship with the unseen, that made him different, though he did not yet know what it would cost or where it would lead. He became familiar with the sea, not first as a sailor, but as a boy watching from the shore, his feet on sand still warm from the sun while his eyes wandered far beyond what could be seen. And there was something in the sound of the waves that spoke to him in a language older than his own, something steady, endless, honest, and without cruelty, and though he could not yet explain it, felt drawn not to its violence or its riches, but to its rhythm, to its refusal to be owned, and in time, that rhythm became a part of him, like breath, like thought. When he first stepped aboard a ship, it was not with certainty, but with reverence. The way one enters a sacred place not built of stone, but of motion, of timber and rope and sky. Everything aboard had a voice, the creak of the hull, the sigh of the canvas, the low murmur of the crew, and he listened to it all, not as a commander, but as a student, watching how the sea shaped men, how men shaped stories, how stories shaped courage. And in those early voyages, where he held no title and made no decisions, he learned everything not from books or orders, but from tides, from stars, from silence. He never sought attention, and yet he was noticed not for boldness or brilliance, but for the way he stood at the rail long after others had gone below deck, for the way he handled maps like something living, for the way he spoke little but saw much, and those around him, though they did not understand what stirred in him, recognized something steady, something certain, something that would one day carry others across waters they feared to name. Magellan's dreams, though rarely spoken aloud, were not of empire or conquest, but of knowing, of seeing what lay beyond the final line of ink, of answering the question that had pulsed through him since boyhood: could the world be whole? Could it be drawn not in parts, but in a circle, one line without end, like the rosaries he had seen pass through his mother's fingers, like the rings worn by sailors who believed in safe returns, like the horizon itself, always present, always just out of reach? And it was this dream, not loud, not heroic, but persistent, that shaped him more than any crown or commission ever could. A dream that pressed quietly against his ribs every time he looked at the night sky, that whispered to him in foreign harbors and storm-swept decks, that made him risk more than comfort, more than rank, more than peace, for the chance to answer it. In time, he began to plan not with ambition, but with precision, studying currents and charts, speaking with captains and mystics alike, gathering not power but knowledge, and each step he took was deliberate, not out of strategy, but out of respect for what he was about to ask of the world and of himself. Because to sail into the unknown was not just to face danger, but to ask permission of forces older than kings. He was a man of faith, yes. But his faith was not blind. It was the kind that sought through wonder, that believed in the divine, not as a figure on a throne, but as a whisper in the wind, a glow on the water, a silence deep enough to contain all questions. And in that belief he found courage, not the kind that charges, but the kind that endures, that waits, that listens. People began to speak of him then, not loudly. It's not often, but with a certain tone, as one speaks of a man already halfway elsewhere, whose thoughts walk ahead of his steps. And though some doubted and others scoffed, none could deny that something in him felt inevitable, like a tide rising so slowly you only notice once your feet are wet. He was not born to be followed, yet others began to gather, drawn not by charisma or reward, but by the way he spoke of the sea, as one speaks of a beloved, by the quiet clarity of his purpose, by the sense that if they sailed with him, they would not be chasing glory, but joining a question that had waited long enough to be answered. And in the quiet before departure, in those final days of preparation and pause, Magellan stood not at the center of a stage, but at the edge of everything he had known, holding in his hands not weapons but coordinates, not certainty but reverence. And as he looked out across the water, he did not feel triumph or fear, but stillness, the kind that comes when a life has bent slowly, patiently, into alignment with something greater than itself. There comes a time in every life when a question long buried begins to press upward, like a root searching for light. Not urgently, not violently, but with a patience so absolute that it becomes impossible to ignore. And for Magellan, that moment was not loud or dramatic, but slow and steady, like the tide reclaiming the shore inch by inch. A moment that arrived in fragments, half-formed thoughts that returned with every sunrise, lingering sensations that stirred beneath the surface of daily routines, the way the horizon seemed to look back at him when he gazed too long. And though nothing in his world had outwardly changed, everything within him had begun to shift, quietly, inevitably, as if a new gravity had taken hold and was gently pulling him toward something he had not yet named, but had always known was waiting. He did not wake one morning and decide to leave behind the life he knew instead, The decision gathered itself slowly over time, like mist thickening over a quiet harbor, until one day it was simply there, complete and undeniable. Not an impulse or ambition, but a calling. One that did not shout or demand, but whispered through his bones, through the stillness between his breaths. And so he began, not with proclamations or plans, but with listening, and with walking the edges of harbors in silence, studying the rhythm of the sea with new attention. Revisiting old maps not to trace routes but to feel the places where the ink stopped, and he wondered not what had already been found, but what might exist just beyond those soft, unfinished lines where the world had run out of words. His steps forward were not marked by flags or horns, but by conversations held beneath lanterns, and by glances exchanged across weathered tables. By long hours spent in the company of those who had lived through storms and shipwrecks, and had returned not with stories of treasure, but of distance, of wind, of silence. And Magellan asked them not for facts or favors, but for memory. Where had the sky turned unfamiliar? When had the currents pulled against logic? What had they seen in the dark that made them believe there was still more beyond? And he took their answers not as certainty, but as soundings of possibility, as quiet pieces of a puzzle that he alone could feel taking shape just beneath the surface of the known. There were obstacles, as there always are for those who ask too deeply or dream to far closed doors. Cautious smiles, skepticism masked in courtesy, and in those moments, when another man might have raged or withdrawn, Magellan simply remained still, not from weakness, but from understanding. Because he knew that time like the sea did not respond to pressure, but to presence. And so he waited, not passively, but attentively, listening even to the refusals. Watching how alliances formed and dissolved, how curiosity could be dressed as diplomacy. In every setback he found refinement, not retreat. Shaping his intentions with the same care a shipwright uses to bend wood into something seaworthy. He watched the stars not for omens, but for rhythm, for pattern, for continuity. And as others consulted charts for trade winds and safe passages, he searched the heavens for deeper alignment, wondering if perhaps the cosmos had always been telling a story larger than trade, larger than war, a story written not in conquests, but in orbits, in tides, in the quiet language of repetition and return. And it was in this language he began to write his own preparations, not in speeches or manifestos, but in moments of clarity, in the certainty that each small step he took was part of a greater unfolding that could only be seen from far above, from the height of stars. And when the opportunity finally arrived, fragile, conditional, tangled in politics and suspicion, he did not rush to seize it, but stood still and breathed. As one does before stepping into a current they know cannot be resisted, and with that breath, he accepted not just a voyage, but the surrender of everything familiar, the relinquishing of comfort, the embrace of risk not for riches, but for understanding, for the chance to draw a single unbroken circle around the world and feel what it meant to be held within it. The ships themselves became companions before they ever touched water. He visited them during construction, not as an overseer, but as a witness, running his fingers along the planks, listening to the whisper of rope pulled taut, smelling the sharp tang of pitch and the salt wind already curling into the sails. And he named them in his heart long before paint touched their hulls, giving them not titles of glory, but names that resonated with patience, with hope, with the quiet strength of things meant to last. He did not choose his crew for obedience or fear, but for something softer, something more enduring, the capacity for wonder, the steadiness of those who could watch the same horizon for days without despair, the resilience of those who had lost and continued anyway. And he spoke to them not as a commander, but as a fellow traveler, inviting them not into service, but into a question, and those who answered did so, not because of promises made, but because something in Magellan's gaze, steady, inward, far-seeing, reminded them of something they had once believed as boys, something they had almost forgotten until that moment. Each night, as the departure drew near, he returned to the maps, not to measure routes, but to feel them, running his hands over the coastlines like reading Braille, listening for what the paper could not say. And in those hours, he was not alone. The sea called to him, not in waves, but in memory, in the pull of tide against shore, in the creak of wood and the stillness, and sometimes he would close his eyes and simply breathe, trusting that what moved through him was not his alone, but something older, something vast, something waiting to be remembered. And when the day of departure finally arrived, it did so without spectacle, no parade. No banners, no grand farewells, only the quiet shuffle of boots on wet docks, the scent of salted provisions, the distant call of gulls. And in that subtle chaos, Magellan stood as he always had, still at the center of motion, not needing to speak because his silence had already spoken everything. And as the ropes were untied and the sails began to fill, he felt no thrill or fear, only the deep, calm sense of alignment that the life he had lived until now had been not a prelude, but a preparation. The last thing he did before stepping aboard was pause at the edge of the dock and touch the water, letting his fingers rest there for a moment, not in superstition but in reverence, as if asking permission of the sea one final time. And in that gesture, gentle and unnoticed by most, lived everything: his gratitude, his fear, his memory, his hope. And as he rose and walked the final few steps onto the ship, the tide turned without fanfare, and the world, in its own quiet way, began to move. The world beyond the quiet harbor was not simply a backdrop to Magellan's journey, was a living, breathing entity, a vast tapestry woven from countless threads of whispered rumors, cautious glances, and the slow, almost imperceptible unfolding of news that moved not with the urgency of modern speed, but by the steady and deliberate rhythm of horses' hooves on cobblestones, sailors' footsteps echoing on wooden docks, and the rustling of parchment carried carefully through winding streets. And though to the common folk life continued as it had for generations, women tending gardens with hands roughened by seasons, children laughing as they chased stray cats through sun-dappled alleyways, fishermen mending nets worn thin by salt and time, beneath these familiar routines stirred an undercurrent, a subtle breeze that shifted the very air, brushing against skin with a softness that left one wondering if the world itself was awakening to something vast and unspoken. A change that did not announce itself with the blare of trumpets, but with the gentle, persistent hum of possibility threading its way through markets and taverns, courts and camps alike, as stories of a voyage set to circle the world slipped from lips in half-spoken sentences and cautious hopes, filling the spaces between people like a rising tide that no one yet knew how far it would reach, far from the salt-sweet breath of the sea and the creak of moored ships, in the heavy, shadowed halls where kings and their counselors gathered beneath tapestries rich with history and power. The news of Magellan's impending voyage was met with voices calm and measured, but eyes that betrayed a deeper unrest, the kind that comes when the maps of authority and dominion suddenly reveal edges fraying into uncertainty, when the carefully drawn lines that marked possession and control begin to dissolve under the weight of the unknown, and as couriers hurried through rain-slick streets bearing letters sealed with wax and urgency, the wheels of empire turned slowly, caught between the thirst for expansion and the deep, ancient fear that some things like the vastness of the ocean and the silence beyond the horizon could not be owned or tamed, but only approached with reverence. And it was in this tension, between ambition and wonder, that the true motion of the world began to ripple outward like circles across still water, each wave carrying with it the fragile hopes and quiet fears of those who had watched the sea, as all their lives and knew both its gifts and its merciless indifference. Within the humble taverns and crowded docks where the scent of tar mixed with sweat and smoke, the mood among sailors and dock workers was a strange weave of anticipation and unease. The rhythm of their daily toil chipping rust, hauling ropes, stacking barrels heavy with salted meat and hard tacks, lowing as conversations, dropped into hushed tones and eyes flickered toward the horizon with a new kind of longing. A mixture of curiosity and ancient wordless fear that had settled over seafarers since time immemorial, that feeling of standing on the threshold of a dream too vast to hold, where the blue of sky and sea blur into one endless mystery, and though none dared speak too loudly of the dangers ahead, every glance and every silence carried the weight of what might be waiting beyond the edge of the known world, a place where legend and reality danced together in the twilight, where dragons might sleep beneath waves and the sea might simply open to swallow those who dared to cross it. And in these quiet moments, the hearts of men beat slower, deeper, as if preparing themselves for a journey not just across water, but through time itself. As merchants adjusted their ledgers and recalculated risks, their thoughts weighed not just in gold, but in uncertainty, balancing the promise of new trade routes against the possibility that ships might be lost forever to storms or strange lands. And in village kitchens, where mothers prepared simple meals by firelight, whispered prayers rose like smoke to the ceiling, prayers not just for safe passage, but for the endurance of those who would leave and the patience of those who would wait. And amidst the mingling scents of fresh bread and salted fish, the notion of distance took on a new meaning, stretching across oceans and years, touching lives that would never meet but whose fates would be forever intertwined by the slow, unyielding hand of exploration, reminding all who lived in those coastal towns that their world was already far larger and more tangled than their quiet streets suggested, and that this expedition was both a beginning and a continuation, a delicate thread in the ever-expanding fabric of human experience. Even in the smallest corners of the world, where time seemed to fold gently over itself, and the sun cast long shadows on cobbled lanes there, was a sensation of waking, stirring as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath and was preparing to exhale into something new. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their endless dance, their constellations blinking quietly with ancient light, people paused in their daily rhythms, feeling without knowing that the tides were shifting, that the stillness before movement was thick with promise, and that the steady turning of the globe beneath their feet was about to touch them all in ways both subtle and profound. Stories traveled like the slow unfolding of dawn, not exploding like fireworks, but blossoming gently in the minds and hearts of those who heard them. Shaped by the teller's voice and the listener's longing, some speaking of golden riches and heroic deeds, others of danger and loss, and still others who saw only a man and his ships, daring to trace a line that no one had yet dared follow. And within these tales lived the delicate tension of anticipation, the quiet pulse of possibility that beat beneath the surface of every whispered word and every shared glance, the gentle heartbeat of a world readying itself to be known anew. Through all this movement, Magellan remained a figure both distant and deeply present, like a steady stone in a shifting stream, moving through currents of power and people with a calm born not of certainty, but of acceptance and grace, knowing that the journey ahead was not only of distance, but of transformation, and that the true voyage would test not only maps and ships, but hearts and souls, and in his gaze, steady and far-seeing, one could glimpse the silent language of one who listens closely to the world as it turns beneath his feet and within his own being, feeling the pulse of change as both challenge and invitation. The sea itself responded with a quiet patience, not with storms or sudden tempests, but with the slow, deliberate stillness of waiting, holding space for the coming journey, like the deep breath taken before the plunge, and as the ships were provisioned, sails mended and ropes tightened. The rhythm of preparation moved through days and nights like a sacred ritual. The scraping of wood and the soft murmur of plans whispered low, and without haste becoming the heartbeat of a world bracing for motion, the slow unfolding of something older and larger than any single man or moment. At bustling markets, where traders from distant lands exchanged goods and news, voices wove a rich tapestry of languages and accents, carrying glimpses of places that most could only imagine. And in the presence of these travelers and their stories was the unspoken truth that the world was already vast and tangled beyond reckoning, and that Magellan's voyage was at once a continuation of this great thread and a new question posed to the ocean's vastness, waiting to be answered by waves and wind and the steady courage of those who dared to listen, to watch, and to follow where few had dared to go. Even the stars, those silent watchers of the night, seemed to lean closer, their familiar constellations flickering with new light, marking the passage of a moment that would ripple far beyond their quiet vigil. A cosmic breath held just long enough for something new to be born, and in the deep hush of night, when the world balanced between dreams and waking, one might still hear the soft murmur of sails unfurling and the gentle hum of a voyage beginning not just on the water, but in the hearts of all who waited and watched. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath, and the soft veil of night lingered heavy upon the land and sea, Magellan found himself alone upon the deck of a ship yet to leave harbor. The wooden planks cooled beneath his bare feet as he breathed slowly, deliberately, drawing in the salt-tinged air as if it might steady the fluttering thoughts within. And in that solitude, time stretched and folded gently around him, the distant murmur of waves lapping against the hull, becoming a steady rhythm that matched the slow beating of his heart. And as his gaze drifted upward to the indifferent stars, he felt the vastness of the universe settle softly into his bones, a silent reminder that the journey ahead was not only of distance, but of surrender to something far greater than himself. The darkness wrapped itself like a quiet shawl, a protective cocoon that softened the edges of the world and allowed thoughts to flow unspoken, unjudged. And in that space, Magellan's mind wandered through memories and dreams, its moments of boyhood beneath unfamiliar skies. The taste of salt on lips and the steady presence of the sea as a constant companion. And yet alongside these familiar threads ran the weight of questions, questions without clear answers, that curled like smoke in the still air, reminding him that solitude was not simply an absence, but a presence, a space where the soul could confront its own whispers and find, perhaps, the courage to step forward, even when the path was shrouded in uncertainty. Beneath the quiet expanse of sky, the ship itself seemed to breathe with him, the gentle creak of timbers settling, the soft rustle of ropes swaying in the faint breeze, the distant call of a lone gull breaking the hush hand. In these subtle sounds, Magellan found an unspoken companionship, a reminder that even in solitude he was not alone, that the vessel beneath his hands was a bridge between worlds, between the known and the unknown, and that every plank and nail carried within it the hopes and fears of those who had dared to dream of crossing horizons that lay just beyond sight. His thoughts moved like the slow tides, ebbing and flowing between resolve and doubt, the steady flame of determination flickering alongside the shadows of fear. And in the spaces between breaths, he listened closely to the quiet voice within that spoke not of conquest or glory, but of wonder and understanding, of a desire to touch the edge of the world not with force, but with reverence. And this inner dialogue, though silent to all but himself, was as vital as the wind that would soon fill the sails and carry them into the vast embrace of the ocean. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying with it faint scents of seaweed and distant fires, the mingling aromas weaving a tapestry of place and time that seemed to hold all the world's secrets in its gentle grasp. And as he stood in that stillness, Magellan felt the weight of history settle softly upon him, not as a burden, but as a mantle woven from countless hands reaching back through time. And in that moment, the lines between past, present, and future blurred into one continuous thread, pulling him forward even as it grounded him in the deep roots of all that had come before. There was a certain sacredness to these moments, a quiet holiness born of being fully present in the space between what was and what could be. And as the stars traced their slow arcs across the velvet sky, Magellan closed his eyes and let himself drift, not toward sleep, but toward a deeper waking, a state where fear and hope intertwined, and the soul could move beyond the confines of certainty into a place of openness and grace, where every heartbeat was a prayer and every breath a step along a path that stretched endlessly into the unknown. In this solitude, time lost its sharp edges and became a gentle current, carrying him not only toward distant lands, but inward to the stillness that lies beneath all movement. And though the journey would be long and filled with uncertainty, here in the quiet dark, there was a sacred calm, pause that allowed the restless spirit to settle and the heart to remember. That courage is often found not in bold declarations, but in the quiet acceptance of what cannot be controlled. And as the first faint light of dawn began to touch the horizon, softening the darkness with hues of rose and gold, Magellan remained motionless for a moment longer, savoring the fragile beauty of beginnings, the delicate balance between night and day, between fear and hope, knowing that soon the world would awaken fully, and the steady motion of the voyage would begin. But here, in this sacred breath before the journey, he was wholly present, rooted in the silence, cradled by the sea, and ready to move forward with a heart both open and steady. The atmosphere aboard the ships began to shift imperceptibly, yet irrevocably, as if the very air had thickened with a quiet weight that settled over every plank of wood and every soul present. A tension that was neither loud nor abrupt, but a persistent, slow-moving fog that wrapped itself around the decks, creeping into corners where shadows lingered and softening the familiar sounds of preparation into muted, thoughtful silences that spoke volumes without a single word spoken. And in this growing stillness, each breath taken felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the crew were collectively holding their pulse in anticipation of a world that was beginning to unspool its threads beyond the edges of their maps, where certainty faded like a distant light swallowed by the gathering dusk. And every heartbeat echoed the quiet, unspoken awareness that the journey ahead would stretch beyond physical endurance, demanding a resilience of spirit and mind as vast as the ocean itself. Within this hush, the smallest gestures took on profound meaning. The tightening of a knot became a ritual of reassurance. A folding of a map carried the weight of plans and hopes not yet spoken aloud. A glance exchanged between weathered men who had long navigated the unpredictable sea now brimmed with layers of unspoken fears and cautious trust. And these subtle communications, woven through the fabric of daily tasks, conveyed a depth of emotion that words could never fully capture. For beneath the surface of practiced calm lay a wellspring of tension that coursed like a hidden current, pulling at the edges of certainty and reminding each man of the fragile threshold upon which they stood, poised between the familiar comforts of routine and the daunting expanse of the unknown, where legend and reality blurred and the future whispered in restless tides. Below decks, in the close, dimly lit quarters where flickering lanterns cast soft shadows on the worn wood, conversations took on a quieter, more intimate tone. Stories once told with boisterous pride, now softened by the pressing reality of what lay ahead. Laughter emerged like fragile sparks in the night, delicate and fleeting, carrying with it the fragile balance of hope tempered by anxiety. And in these moments, the men found solace in shared memory and camaraderie, even as their minds wandered to distant shores in the uncertain passage of time that separated them from home and those they loved, while the ever-present murmur of the sea outside served as a steady, unyielding reminder of the vastness enveloping them and the countless unknowns that lay beyond the horizon's edge. Above deck, the sky itself seemed to mirror this unfolding tension, the deepening blue slowly shading into the somber grays of approaching evening clouds, their slow, measured movement across the heavens, a silent meditation on patience and change, as if even the air conspired to remind those aboard that tension is not merely a sign of conflict, but a sacred space of waiting. A breath held between what has been and what will be, and within this liminal moment exists a quiet strength born from the willingness to embrace uncertainty without resistance, to hold open the fragile portal through which transformation must pass, knowing that the journey ahead is as much an internal voyage as it is a physical crossing of seas. The men, accustomed to the rhythm of the sea and the steadiness of known courses, found themselves navigating an unfamiliar emotional tide, their bodies moving with the muscle memory of years at sea, even as their thoughts drifted to uncharted waters, places marked by silence and mystery on the edges of their charts. And in the rare moments when the vast calm of the ocean invited reflection, memories surfaced like gentle waves, mingling with the quiet questions that filled the spaces between heartbeats, weaving a complex tapestry of hope, fear, and a deep, abiding courage that rose slowly from the depths of shared experience and individual resolve, anchoring each soul against the shifting currents of doubt. Amidst the gentle creaking of timbers and the rhythmic slap of water against the hull, the tension that filled the air was a steady, unspoken hum, a pulse felt in the tightening grip of hands resting on worn railings, in the slow, measured steps that carried men across the decks, and in the fleeting moments when eyes met and held without words, conveying a collective understanding that the road ahead was cloaked in uncertainty, and that true strength would be required not only in physical endurance, but in the quiet steadiness of spirit and mind, as they prepared to journey into the vast, unknowable embrace of the sea and all that it promised and threatened in equal measure. As dusk deepened into night, lantern light flickered softly, casting warm glows across faces etched with lines of resolve, worry, and a quiet determination to meet whatever may come. The shared silences between men carried the weight of unspoken fears folded into hope, where the smallest sounds, the distant cry of a seabird, the soft whisper of waves against the hull, the faint rustle of sails became reminders of the delicate balance held between safety and risk, between the anchor of the past and the ever-persistent pull of the unknown, and as the first stars began to pierce the dark velvet canopy of night, their steady light offered a silent assurance that even within tension there is a grace, a patient unfolding of courage and resilience that prepares the heart to face the vastness beyond the horizon. The moment when the world seems to shift beneath one's feet often arrives not with the clamor of thunder, but with the softest, almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. A subtle rearrangement of the familiar that quietly unfolds until suddenly the landscape of possibility feels new and uncharted. And for Magellan and his crew, this turning point came wrapped in the gentle embrace of dawn. When the sky slowly bled soft hues of pink and lavender across the horizon, touching the stillness of the sea with a delicate light that whispered of beginnings and endings intertwined, and as the ships prepared to untie their moorings, the heavy weight of anticipation mingled with a fragile hope, marking the fragile line between what had been and what was about to be forever altered. In that early morning calm, the silence was more than absence of sound, it was a presence. Sacred space where time seemed to pause and breathe alongside those who stood at the threshold of transformation. And within this stillness, every sensation was heightened, the gentle sway of the ships as they stirred against their anchors, the faint scent of salt and timber mingling in the cool air, the soft rustle of canvas as sails were unfurled with deliberate care. Each movement slow and purposeful, like a ritual performed by hands both steady and reverent, and beneath it all, the unspoken understanding that this moment was a hinge upon which the entire journey would pivot, a quiet yet profound shift that carried within it the seeds of all that was to come. The men aboard the vessels moved with a deliberate grace, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of preparation, even as their minds lingered on the precipice of the unknown. And in their eyes flickered a blend of determination, curiosity, and a tender vulnerability born of leaving behind the familiar in pursuit of something vast and ineffable. Though they had trained and planned for months, perhaps years, the true test lay not in their knowledge or skill, but in the willingness to embrace the unknown with open hearts and steady hands, to meet uncertainty not as an enemy, but as an ancient companion whose presence demands both respect and courage. As the first ropes were cast off and the ships began to drift slowly from their safe harbor, the water beneath them caught the dawn's light in shimmering reflections that danced like fleeting promises. Each ripple a gentle reminder that motion once begun is unstoppable, and that the world beyond the harbor waited with all its mystery and challenge. Vast and indifferent, yet filled with possibilities whispered only to those who dared to listen deeply, and as Magellan stood at the helm, his gaze fixed not on the shore receding behind, but on the horizon ahead, he carried within him the weight of countless dreams and the fragile, flickering flame of resolve that had drawn him to this very moment. The turning point was not marked by a grand announcement or dramatic gesture, but by the steady, unhurried progress of ships moving into open water, the slow unfolding of a path that had never before been charted in full. And in this gradual departure from the known, there was a powerful symbolism, a surrender to the flow of time and tide, quiet affirmation that life itself is a journey, not always defined by milestones, but by the willingness to keep moving forward when the way is uncertain and the destination unclear. And in this understanding lay a deep, meditative strength that sustained the hearts and minds of those aboard. Beneath the calm surface of the sea and sky, beneath the careful motions of sailors and the silent prayers whispered in darkened quarters, there was a shift as profound as any storm, a movement within the souls of those who dared to embark on this journey, a turning inward even as their bodies moved outward into the vast embrace of the ocean. And in this convergence of motion and stillness, the voyage truly began, not just as a passage across water, but as a passage through the depths of human spirit, where every choice and every breath carried the weight of possibility and the fragile hope of discovery. There comes a point in every voyage not marked on any map nor etched into the logs, where the distance already traveled seems to suspend itself in the air like salt-laced mist, and the path ahead, though steadily unfolding, becomes blurred by questions too quiet to voice. And it was in this liminal space that Magellan and his crew now drifted, somewhere between the warm breath of hope and the chill fingers of doubt, caught not in storms or visible threats, but in the subtle, persistent weight of the unknown, where each sunrise brought not comfort, but a deepened awareness of just how vast the world truly was, and how small and tender the human heart could feel in its presence. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, as a shifting mirror of sky and thought, its moods delicate and unknowable. And beneath the soft rhythm of waves and sails, there grew a silence that was no longer restful but heavy, a silence filled with the things no one dared speak aloud, the slow erosion of certainty. The questions that rose like ghosts from the depths at night, the dreams that had once carried them forward now flickering like lanterns in the wind. And though the men moved and worked as always, their hands calloused and sure, their eyes had begun to seek answers in the horizon, as if the sea itself might whisper back some sign that they were not drifting further from themselves. There were nights when the stars blinked with a cold clarity, and Magellan would find himself alone above deck, hands wrapped loosely around the worn railing, the salt wind pressing gently against his face. And in those moments he felt the pull of gravity not from the earth beneath but from within. A kind of quiet gravity that tugged at the deepest part of his being, asking questions he could not yet answer. Was this the path of revelation or of folly? Was he guiding the men toward something wondrous, or leading them away from everything they had ever known? And still he stood, breathing slowly, letting the sky soak into him, seeking not certainty but calm in the presence of doubt. By day the ships moved with grace, but no destination in sight, only the sun to mark the hours, and the wind to guide their passage. And though the crew performed their duties with quiet professionalism, there were signs, small and steady, that the tension had become something deeper. Gaze held a moment too long, sentence begun and left unfinished. The echo of footsteps at night, when rest should have claimed the man in those spaces between words and action. Hope and doubt danced like smoke, twining together in a fragile balance, both necessary, both real, both shaping the soul of the journey in ways no map could chart. There were days when the sea was so still it seemed the world had ceased to move entirely, the sails hanging slack like forgotten promises, the silence pressing close like the inside of a chapel, and in those hours the men began to feel time differently, not as a measure of distance, but as a weight, as if each passing second carried more than itself, filled with memories of land, of laughter, smells, and voices that now felt impossibly far away, and with each slow breath they took, the question returned. How much longer? How much farther? And most of all, was this all leading anywhere at all? Hope, when it came, did not arrive with certainty, but as a feeling in the chest of warmth that grew slowly when the winds returned, or when a bird crossed the sky overhead, or when the stars formed a familiar shape, reminding them of home or of a story once told. And in those fragile moments, the doubt softened, not vanishing but folding itself into something smaller, something bearable. And Magellan learned to hold both states at once, the aching pull of doubt and the gentle persistence of belief, learning to breathe through both, to let them rise and fall like the tide, knowing that neither could be banished, only lived through. And in this slow rhythm, between fear and faith, between longing and resignation, the voyage continued not as a single unbroken line, but as a slow spiral of emotion and resolve, circling the vast inner ocean of each soul aboard. And the true journey, the one no map would ever capture, was not over the surface of the sea, but through the shifting waters of the self, where every sailor, no matter his rank, was confronted with his own edge, his own quiet reckoning with the truth that to venture far was to be forever changed, and that some parts of oneself would be left behind in every mile, sailed into the unknown. There are forms of bravery that go unnoticed by history's pen, acts of quiet endurance that do not echo in halls or monuments, but settle instead into the bones of those who lived them, and aboard Magellan's ships. This bravery was not found in the clash of swords or the shouting of orders, but in the soft persistence of men who rose each morning into the same uncertainty, whose hands moved through the same motions despite the ache of fatigue and the shadows cast by fear. And it was this quiet kind of bravery, wordless, patient, almost invisible, that carried the voyage forward. A collective will that refused to shatter, even when the silence of the sea stretched so long it began to feel like it might never speak again. It was there in the man who climbed the mast each dawn, even when the wind bit hard and the rope stung his fingers, his eyes scanning the endless line where sky met water, not in search of glory, but simply because it was his task. and to perform it was to affirm that the world still turned and the journey still held meaning. And though no one cheered him, no one marked his name, his act became part of the quiet rhythm that kept the crew breathing. A living thread woven into the fabric of hope, pulled tight but never snapped. It lived in the cook, who measured out the dwindling supplies with care, who stirred pots of salt meat and lentils in the swaying dimness below deck, and offered not a feast, but warmth. Consistency, familiarity, a kind of nourishment that extended beyond the body into the spirit, reminding the men through each simple meal that someone still tended to them, that order still existed amid the uncertainty, and that such small gestures could stave off despair longer than words ever could. Magellan himself wore this bravery not like a banner, but like a second skin, quiet and unyielding. His presence steady, even when his thoughts surely churned with doubt and weight. And though he spoke little of his own burden, the men saw it in the way he listened. In the calm of his gaze, when storms threatened or tempers flared, in the way he stood at the helm during long stretches of silence, when there was nothing to command but patience, and in these moments, his leadership became less about direction and more about stillness, a reminder that to lead was sometimes to hold steady the center while the world swayed. There were days when illness moved through the ships like a shadow, slow and indiscriminate, and the bravery of those who stayed beside the sick, who tended to fevers and offered water in silence, was immense in its humility, for they asked nothing in return and knew the risks, and still chose to stay close. To comfort in whatever small ways they could, their presence a balm not just to the suffering but to the entire vessel, an act of love that spoke softly yet resonated through every corridor of the ship. Even the smallest decisions, choosing to rise, to work, to speak with kindness, became acts of resistance against the pull of fear and despair. And over time, these choices shaped the soul of the voyage far more than any discovery or map. For they revealed a truth often overlooked in tales of conquest, that the most enduring bravery is not found in moments of triumph, but in the long, unglamorous perseverance of the human spirit in the face of doubt, hardship, and the unknowable. Sometimes the wind would die for days, the sea stretching around them like a vast sheet of glass, unmoving, silent, immense. And in those hours of stilled breath and absent motion, the true test arose not of strength or skill, but of heart, of one's ability to sit inside stillness without losing oneself, to meet the echo of one's own thoughts without fear. And those who endured such days learned something deep and rare, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to remain open-hearted even when nothing ahead offers reassurance. The camaraderie that grew among the crew was forged not by joy but by hardship, not in celebration but in shared silence, in the exchange of glances that said more than words, in the steady hand offered during storms, or the quiet nod after a sleepless night. And this web of connection, invisible and unspoken, became one of the voyage's greatest sources of strength, a net that caught those who faltered. A reminder that no one suffered alone, and that even the smallest gestures could carry a soul through dark waters. Each man aboard had his own secret fears, his own private memories that surfaced in the hush of night or in the still hours before dawn. And to face them daily, to carry them quietly, to live with them, and still rise again each morning. It's a kind of bravery the world seldom honors, yet one that speaks to the deepest truth of being human, that we continue not because we are fearless, but because we choose, again and again, to walk forward through the fog with hope as our only compass. And so the ships moved forward, not through force or dominance, but through the accumulated strength of these silent acts, each moment of kindness, of endurance, of patience layering one atop another like planks upon a whole, forming something seaworthy not just in form but in soul. And though no monument would rise to name these moments, they were the heartwood of the voyage, the quiet bravery that kept it afloat when the tides of doubt threatened to pull it under. And in that, there was a kind of nobility deeper than legend, steady and slow and profoundly real. What remains after the sails are folded, after the last fire has burned down to soft embers, after the names once whispered over wind and salt fade into silence? It's not always found in records or stones or the orderly lines of history. It lives elsewhere. In quieter places, in the slow way memories settle into the corners of the mind like dust that glows golden when the light catches it just right. And for those who survived the long voyage, what remained was not triumph or conquest, but a deep, wordless transformation. A soft knowing that they had been carried far beyond the edge of any map, not just across oceans, but across the vast terrain of the self, and that nothing, not their thoughts, nor their sleep, nor the way they breath would, ever return entirely to how it was before. The things left behind could not be packed in crates or measured in weight. Their old fears, once so sharp, had worn smooth like pebbles turned over by time and tide, and the days that had passed in silence had not vanished but become part of them, folded into the marrow of their bones like salt, and the friendships formed not in joy but in endurance remained long after the anchors dropped, sometimes spoken aloud in passing laughter, sometimes carried quietly in the way a hand lingered on wood, or how a gaze softened at the mention of sea or sky. And these were the inheritances of the journey, not medals, not riches, but small and sacred remnants of a shared survival that would never quite fit into words. Some things had been lost, of course. And not only men, though the names of those who perished would never be fully known. Their absence was etched deeply into every creak of timber, every shadow cast by empty hammocks, every pause in conversation where a voice had once belonged, and alongside the fallen, other losses made their home within the returning men. The innocence of certainty, the comfort of believing the world to be small and knowable, the ease of forgetting that one's life is as fragile as a rope pulled taut in wind, and yet even this grief became part of the fabric they now carried. Not as weight, but as a kind of sacred thread running quietly through the center of their days. For Magellan, who did not live to see the circle close, what remained was something more elusive still, a legacy not bound in pages, but in the very act of continuing, of others carrying on in the spaces he once dreamed into being. And though his body lay buried beneath unfamiliar stars, far from the place of his birth, what endured was not his death but the quiet echo of his vision, a whisper that traveled from ship to ship, from man to man, carried not as command but as memory, as a hush that said, "We are more than we thought, and the world is wider than we knew, and sometimes it takes losing your way to truly understand the shape of the journey." What remained for the world was not simply a new route or altered map, but a shift in how the unknown was seen, not as something monstrous or forbidding, but as a place to be approached with humility and awe. And though the lines drawn across the globe changed forever, it was the invisible lines, the ones inside hearts, between souls, beneath the surface of thought, that bore the deepest mark. And in ports where they landed, in stories passed by word of mouth, in the slow drift of language and scent and gesture from one shore to another, the remnants of that voyage scattered like seeds on the wind, never entirely gone, always resurfacing in the quiet corners of the world. Some of what remained would never be known, scraps of journal pages lost to sea spray, songs hummed below deck that vanished into the wood, dreams dreamt on long nights that dissolved with the morning sun, and yet even these, though unrecorded, had their place. Because memory is not only what is kept, but what is felt, what shapes us without needing to be named. And the voyage left such impressions like soft indents on the skin after a long sleep, reminders that the world had pressed itself into them, and in doing so, left something behind that would ripple outward long after the ships had vanished over the horizon. There were those who returned home and found it no longer fit, not because the land had changed, but because they had, and what remained within them was a horizon that could not be unseen. A vastness that lived behind their eyes, a slowness in their step that came not from weariness, but from having walked through the unknown and survived it. And they spoke little, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence. For how do you explain to someone who has never seen it the feeling of wind after weeks of stillness, or the color of a sky so wide it makes you weep without knowing why? And then there were those who stayed at sea, not because they feared land, but because they had come to understand that their soul had shifted its roots into motion, and what remained for them was not a place, but a rhythm, a way of being that moved with the tides, that listened to wind and stars in silence as one might listen to a loved one breathing in sleep. And for these men, the journey never truly ended, only folded into new beginnings, always carrying with them the quiet hum of what had come before. What remains in the end is not always visible. It lives in how we pause, and how we breathe more deeply after listening to the story of those who traveled far and returned changed, in how we look at maps differently, knowing they are not just marks on paper, but invitations, open hands held out toward mystery, and in how we speak of courage not as noise, but as steadiness, as grace, as the simple act of continuing forward when the way is long and the night is dark. And perhaps what remains most of all is the echo, the soft, endless echo of sails in wind, of oars in water, of one man standing alone beneath an ocean of stars, daring to believe that the world was not only bigger than imagined, but beautiful in its bigness, and that in choosing to meet it not with conquest, but with curiosity, he left behind a path not just across the earth, but through the very heart of what it means to be human. Not all stories are told in words that survive the passage of time. Some are lived in the quiet curve of a gesture, in the worn softness of hands that labored far from glory, in the shadows of great deeds where countless others stood watching, lifting, waiting, dreaming, without ever being named. And aboard Magellan's ships, there were such souls, those whose footsteps echoed below deck, whose breath rose with the rhythm of the sea, whose fears were swallowed down with salted meat and silence. And though history forgets their names, they were the heartbeat of the voyage, steady and uncelebrated, essential and unseen. There was the boy barely more than a child whose job it was to carry messages, to scrub the decks with hands not yet calloused, who listened more than he spoke, and whose eyes held questions too large for his small frame. And though no statue bears his likeness, it was he who watched the stars at night from a coil of rope near the bow, whispering their shapes to himself as though learning a new language, and it was his wonder, unspoiled and intact, that reminded the others men hardened by storms and hunger that something sacred still floated in the unknown. And the cook, who stirred and salted and rationed with a quiet precision that spoke of care, not just for the food, but for the men who would receive it. And though he never stood at the helm or touched a compass, his hands shaped the hours, comforted the sick, listened without speaking. And in every bowl handed out in the dimness of the galley was a kind of gentle defiance against the cold and the distance, a way of saying, "I see you, I am still here, we are not alone." There were those who came from lands already claimed, already marked by empire, whose tongues carried other songs, whose skin bore the imprint of other suns, and yet they worked shoulder to shoulder with the rest. Their histories unspoken, their homes left behind in ways no map recorded, and in the silence of their labor, in the long hours spent gazing at the horizon, perhaps they whispered memories to the wind, fragments of languages never translated, and in doing so, wove their own stories into the water, invisible but enduring. There was a sailor who kept a scrap of parchment folded in the lining of his coat, a letter never sent, a promise never spoken aloud. And when the sea grew to quiet and the mind began to fray at the edges, he would press it between his fingers like a prayer, not for guidance, but for grounding. And it is not known what the letter said or who it was for, but its presence mattered not for its words, but for the hope it carried, the tether it offered to something waiting beyond the waves. In the still moments between shifts, there were whispers, jokes muttered with dry lips, stories told with low laughter or trembling voices, memories traded like coins to purchase just a few minutes of warmth. And though none of these were chronicled, they were the true record of what it meant to endure together, to be human in the midst of the inhuman, to build something real, not from conquest or fame, but from the fragile, flickering light of connection. There were glances passed between strangers who had become brothers, not through blood, but through burden, and in those glances lived lifetimes of shared silence, the kind that needs no translation, no ceremony, only presence. And these unseen exchanges stitched the voyage together in ways no captain's log ever could. Threads of understanding that held through sickness, through storms, through loss, and though they vanished now into history's wide tide, they were real, and they mattered. And sometimes when the night grew too heavy, there were songs, soft, broken, untrained, floating from somewhere below deck, the kind of melody sung not to impress, but to survive. And perhaps it was in those songs that the deepest stories were kept, of homes now unreachable, of names that would never again be called aloud, of lives that had been shaped by the sea not in triumph but in tenderness. And the echoes of those songs, though faint, still drift like sea mist through the corridors of time. There were moments of shared stillness, when no words passed, when no tasks pressed, only the presence of another nearby, a warmth, a rhythm of breath that reminded each man that even here, far from land and familiar sky, they were not alone in their longing. And though no historian wrote these moments down, they formed the true geography of the voyage, the places where one soul met another, not in battle or glory, but in the gentle act of being beside each other in the dark. And what remains of these unseen stories is not found in monuments or maps, but in the soft pulse of recognition felt by any soul who has ever stood at the edge of the known and chosen to step forward anyway, not as hero, not as leader, but as a single, fragile, feeling being whose story may never be told, but whose presence made the journey possible. And if you close your eyes now, you may feel them tooth a cook. The boy, the letter, the song all still here, drifting softly in the space between silence and sea. A legacy does not begin with applause, nor with the carving of statues or the unfurling of banners. It begins in the quiet, in the moments just after the end, when something invisible yet undeniable begins to settle over what remains. Like mist clinging to the deck of a ship just anchored, like the hush in the air when the wind still carries the breath of what was, and though Magellan's journey did not end in his own return, it began to endure the moment his absence became a story, the moment those who had sailed beside him began to speak of him not in command but in memory, not in orders but in presence, in the steady way he had watched the stars, in the weight of his silences, in the questions he asked not aloud, but with his whole being. That legacy did not look like conquest or triumph. It looked like maps redrawn with trembling hands, like new roots etched into the understanding of the world, like the humbler knowledge that the planet was round, not just in theory, but in ache, in hunger, in long watches beneath indifferent skies. And though nations would later claim his voyage as proof of dominion, of superiority, of power stretched across water, there was something deeper and softer in what Magellan left behind, an idea not of ownership, but of continuity, the notion that the world, however vast, could be known through patience, through breath, through an unyielding willingness to listen to its rhythms rather than impose upon them. In the quiet that followed, others took up the path not with the same wind, not with the same stars, but with something of his resolve tucked into their hearts. And whether they knew his name or not, whether they read the chronicles or only heard fragments passed along in taverns and ports, they carried forward a kind of courage that did not shout, that did not rush, but moved like a tide beneath the skin. A slow resolve to follow the line of the horizon and see where it might lead. And in that motion, in that silent decision to continue, Magellan's presence lingered, not as ghost, but as current, not as figurehead, but as question. The world, after his voyage, could no longer pretend to be unbroken. The oceans had been crossed, coastlines connected, silences breached hand, while empires would use this knowledge to expand their reach. What endured more quietly was the shift in the human soul, a widening, a soft recalibration of what was possible. And in the years that followed, when young dreamers stared at the sea with maps in their hands and wonder in their eyes, they were tracing not just routes but the shape of something left behind in wake and wind and starlight, the shape of one man's belief that the unknown was not to be feared but met, gently, with reverence. Stories grew in the absence, layered and embellished and reimagined, as all legacies are, and somewhere between the truth of his gaze on the sea and the myths told around firelight, something tender remained, a thread of yearning that had nothing to do with empire and everything to do with connection. With the desire to belong not just to land or flag but to the whole of the earth, to feel part of a world so vast it humbles you, so interconnected it surprises you, so alive that even in the deepest solitude you are never truly alone. And the ships themselves, even those that never returned, became part of that legacy, their wood weathered, their names etched into salt and time.
Ow.
And somewhere in every port, in every story of a voyage that went further than expected, further than allowed, further than wise, there lived the echo of their shape against the sky, the soft groan of their hulls as they pushed against wind and water, and it is said that some sailors still dream of them not as relics but as guides, as familiar ghosts in the fog that whisper not of destination but of motion. There were also those who never knew of Magellan by name but who lived on islands he passed, who saw the sails darken the horizon like clouds heavy with meaning, who felt the tremble of change long before it arrived in full, And their legacy is quieter, still held in the soil, in the language that bent and resisted, in the ways their lives were touched, altered, entangled, sometimes harmed, sometimes awakened. And though these threads are not often woven into the official histories, they are no less part of what was left behind. For legacy is not only what we build, but what we disturb. Not only what we intend, but what ripples outward without our knowing. And in time, his name found its way into books, into monuments, into classrooms, but always slightly removed, slightly stylized, made into symbol rather than soul. And yet somewhere beneath the weight of interpretation, the man remains the watcher of skies, the listener of tides, the dreamer who chose not to conquer the unknown but to touch it, to move through it with both reverence and resolve. And in remembering him this way, not as myth, but as man, we allow the legacy to remain human, flawed, luminous, tender. Perhaps the truest part of what he left behind is not in maps or statues, but in the moment someone stands at the shore and feels their heart lean forward slightly, pulled by a question they cannot name, a direction they cannot explain, and in that breath, in that slight shift of soul, Magellan's journey begins again, and in the past. But in the present, not in history, but in the hush before a decision, in the choice to trust something unseen. And if you are listening now, with your breath slow and your mind quiet, perhaps you, too, feel it, that pull, not toward glory, but toward presence, toward the deep and sacred understanding that the world is not something to be claimed, but to be honored, and that to leave a legacy is not to be remembered loudly, but to have once moved so gently through the world that it kept moving in your wake long after you were gone. Time does not end a story, it only carries it further, like the tide that keeps rolling in long after the ship has vanished from the horizon. And if you sit still enough, if you breathe slowly and let the present loosen its grip, you might feel it, the echo of a sail catching wind, the soft creak of timber beneath uncertain feet, the low murmur of a man looking up at a sky he could not name but trusted anyway, and in that quiet, something ancient stirs, something that has never truly left us, only grown quieter beneath the noise of modern life. Today, we move through a world that seems mapped and measured, a globe of satellites and signals, where every coastline has been charted and every sea given a name, but beneath all that certainty, the spirit of the unknown still breathes, softly, waiting to be noticed again. And each time someone stands before an open ocean, or a blank page, or an uncertain future, and chooses to take one quiet step forward, the echo of that first great circle begins again, not as history, but as presence, as movement, as a whisper that says, not everything has been seen. The story of Magellan is not just about the world's shape, but about the shape of wonder, of curiosity, of that old, unnameable pull that asks us to trust what we cannot yet grasp. And though centuries have passed, and ships now hum with engines instead of sails, that same hush lingers, the hush of beginnings, of decisions made in silence, of maps redrawn not on paper but in the soul, and in each of us who has ever longed for something just beyond the visible, that echo finds its next vessel. You can hear it in unexpected places, in the way someone looks at the stars from the window of a city bus, or the way a child asks about what lies past the clouds, or the way a traveler touches the earth of a place they've never been and somehow feel at home. And none of these things seem heroic or historic, but they are part of the same thread that once pulled a man westward into nothing but water and sky. They are the soft continuation of the question he carried. What if the world is larger, not only in space, but in meaning? And perhaps that is the quiet gift of stories like his, not to instruct or to glorify, but to awaken, to remind us that we are always, in some way, at the edge of something, and that to move forward is not to conquer, but to listen, to learn, to allow ourselves to be changed. And that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to shout into the unknown, but to whisper to it gently, to meet it not with fear, but with reverence, and to step forward with the slow,
at a steady heart,
of one who knows that even if they do not return the same, the journey will be worth the silence it demands. So when we speak of echoes, we are not speaking of sounds that fade. We are speaking of waves that keep moving, of words that linger in the air long after they're spoken, of paths that open quietly each time someone dares to walk them again. And in that way, Magellan has never been gone. Not really. Not if you've ever stood at a threshold and hesitated. Then breathe deep and step through. Not if you've ever chosen to trust the stars instead of the shore. And now, centuries later, his name floats, not just in history books, but in the stillness of night. In the rhythm of tides, in the dreams of those who feel the world not as a place to master, but as a mystery to move through with humility. And if you've listened this far, if you've allowed the story to seep into the soft spaces between thought and breath, then you too are part of the echo. You carry it now, not loudly, but gently. The way sea carries salt, the way wind carries scent, the way time carries us all. Can you still hear it? That soft murmur of ropes in the dark, the low breath of sails filling. The steady gaze of a man who dared to believe that the earth could be circled, not with conquest, but with wonder. Can you feel it now, in the quiet between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, in the hush of a world not yet fully known? Then rest here for a while if you like not to end the story, but to let it drift within you, gently, like water against hull, like memory against skin. And know that wherever you are, whenever this story has found you, it has found you for a reason, because sometimes the world still waits for someone to listen closely and whisper back. And so, we leave it here not as an ending, but as a quiet letting go, like the tide pulling gently from the shore, like the final note of a song that lingers in the chest long after the voice has gone still. And if your eyes are closed now, and your breath is slowed, perhaps you've begun to drift, not away from the story, but deeper into it, as though Magellan's voyage has folded gently into your own. Somewhere far from where you are now, the sea still breathes, the stars still turn, and the wind still remembers the curve of those old sails. And though time has carried us far from wooden ships and uncharted waters, the longing that once called a man westward still finds its way into quiet hearts and quiet nights. Thank you for letting this story find you, for welcoming its silence, its breath, its memory, and for becoming part of the current that carries it forward, softly across distance and darkness, across time. If you are still awake, perhaps you'll share where this story reached you, beneath what sky, in what hour, in what kind of stillness, and if you are already drifting into sleep, know that another story waits for you, somewhere beyond the horizon of dreams. May the echoes stay with you, not loudly, but like the rhythm of waves against wood, like the hush of wind in the rigging. Like a name whispered into the stars. Sleep well, wherever you are.